So, welcome to this event, Code Command and Consequences, Ethics in the Age of Autonomous Weapons. My name is Brian Green. I'm the Director of Technology Ethics at the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics here at Santa Clara University. We've got a lot of good stuff to talk about today, so I want to get straight to our panelists. And so for our first panelist, we have Dr. Julie Carpenter. She's an external research fellow, and she's online up there in the corner. Dr. Carpenter is an external research fellow with the Ethics and Emerging Sciences Group, a nonpartisan think tank focused on risk, ethics, and social concerns related to new sciences and technologies. Her work examines how trust, decision-making, and emotional connections form between humans and artificial systems. She's the author of the book Culture and Human-Robotic Interaction in Militarized Spaces, A War Story, examining how military personnel establish working relationships with explosive ordnance disposal robots. Insights from her research contribute to UX and safety considerations for semi-autonomous and autonomous weapon systems and other AI-based decision support tools used in high-stakes or time-critical contexts with implications for training, role clarity, human-in-the-loop handoffs, and risk communication. Next, we have Tim Henderson. He graduated from the Naval Academy and served as a submarine officer, qualifying as officer of the deck and senior plant supervisor of the nuclear reactor. He left the Navy to get an MBA at Harvard, and then for several years was a technology venture capitalist. For the last 20 years, he's been a real estate developer and general contractor building apartment buildings in Silicon Valley. He's retiring from that to pursue academic research and has presented on autonomous weapons to the International Society of Military Ethics and multiple classes here at Santa Clara. He currently serves as Vice President of the Military Officers Association of America, Silicon Valley Chapter, and on the Board of Directors for OnView Integrated Solutions. And right next to me we have Lieutenant Colonel David von Bargen. He's the Professor of Military Science here at Santa Clara University, Army. He is a native of Walnut Creek, California. He has a bachelor's degree in political science from George Washington University and a master's in international service from the American University School of International Studies in Washington, D.C. Lieutenant Colonel von Bargen is a military intelligence officer with 19 years in the United States Army. He previously served as a military intelligence trainer at the Army's Training Center in Hohenfels, Germany, and as the deputy commander of the Army's National Ground Intelligence Center. All right, we're going to start our presentation, or we're going to start our panel today with a brief presentation from Tim. So Tim, if you want to take it away.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so thanks, Brian. Great panel. Dr. Carpenter's been working on this for a long time. Colonel von Bargen and everyone in uniform here is on active duty, and so you guys have my thanks and admiration. So I'll start with a definition of highly autonomous weapons. For me, that is those navigating over long periods of time in large geographies and selecting targets and destroying them with completed autonomy. So we're not there yet, but we're very close. We've had the failings close to weapon system on carriers, defending those against missiles. We've had the Harpy loitering munition. Ukraine is particularly prominent in this, so we have both the Russians and the Ukrainians using millions of drones, mostly aerial, but also sea surface, submarine, and ground. And most of the casualties in Ukraine right now are actually caused by autonomous warfare. So my first point of the 3 points is that most people on the planet do not want this to happen. Okay, so we have Pope Francis, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, numerous other religious leaders are on record calling for a ban. Mustafa Suleiman is one of 5,000 AI researchers and 30,000 other people who have signed an open letter calling for a ban. This letter reads in part, autonomous weapons are ideal for tasks such as assassinations, destabilizing nations, subduing populations, and selectively killing a particular ethnic group. We therefore believe that a military AI arms race would not be beneficial for humanity. Jody Williams is a Nobel laureate for her work on a partial ban of landmines. She and 20 other laureates have called for a ban. Kumi Naidu is the former director of both Greenpeace and Amnesty International. He's a friend of mine. I've had a lot of long discussions with him. So Amnesty and numerous other activist groups have called for a ban. So Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. And invariably the precedent question comes up, which is, so we're trying to preserve human agency and limit AI power across every arena of human activity, from mortgages to finance to copyright. And so if we allow algorithms to routinely decide who to kill and who not to kill, then aren't we going in absolutely the wrong direction on all those other issues? UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has been speaking vociferously about this for a decade. He says that highly autonomous weapons are politically unacceptable, morally repugnant, and should be prohibited by international law. Some of the military is also on record as against this. So this is U.S. Air Force General Paul Selva, former vice chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This is the #2 guy in the entire uniformed military. And he says, and I quote, that I don't think it's reasonable to put robots in charge of whether or not we take a human life. He's also on record as saying that there'll be a raucous debate within the Department of Defense on this issue. In addition to General Selva, we have U.S. Air Force General Robert Latiff and Australian General Mike Smith, who I think there should be significant restrictions. And then in 2020, there was a survey of Australian cadets, and a slight majority said that they would be unwilling or somewhat unwilling to serve alongside autonomous weapons. So, unfortunately, and I mean this with all sincerity, I think we have a very strong hypothesis that none of this will matter, that this proliferation of highly autonomous weapons will continue. I think a lot of military leaders think that this is true, but they simply just don't speak about it publicly. If you look at what the UN has tried to do, they've been trying to call for a ban for a decade, and they have been completely unsuccessful because they operate on unanimous consent. And they have actually failed to even define the issue. And when I talk to senior technology executives, they agree with this. So I've spoken with Mustafa Suleyman, with Eric Horvitz, both of whom signed that letter. I've spoken with Eric Schmidt, with Rodney Brooks, both of who declined to sign the letter because they think it's naive. And also, they all agree, directionally at least, with my next point, which is, okay, give me a second here. So my next point, which will come up shortly, is that within 30 years, highly autonomous weapons will become the sine qua non of military power. And I'm going to walk you through quickly 3 scenarios. So let's say, and these are maybe 5 to 15 years in the future. The first is China invades Taiwan. So we have the F-35, the premier military aviation asset in history. It has 8 million lines of code. It has a radar signature the size of a cantaloupe. The Israelis use this to humiliate Iran in the 12-day war. Okay, so it encounters the mysterious dragon, the Chinese uncrewed jet over the Taiwan Strait. But because the mysterious dragon only has a cost of about $25 million versus $100 million for the F-35, there's 4 of them. And they attack completely without fear. They attack with reaction times a fraction of that of a human pilot, longer loiter times. They can withstand a 20G turn that would black out any human pilot. The swarm warfare aspect is very important. So we've already had examples of simulated combat, both virtual and in real aircraft, where the AI triumphs. Now, those are simulated, they're somewhat canned, but I think a lot of people believe that within 30 years that the uncrewed aircraft will triumph. And so Admiral Paparo, Indo-PACOM commander, said that, to this point, I want to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities. 2024. Okay, the middle picture, Mosul, Iraq. So the ISIL, Islamic State, had dug into this city in Iraq for years. They had constructed bunkers, fortifications, tunnels. This is a picture of an Iraqi soldier looking down into a tunnel, deciding whether he wants to go down in the tunnel or not. So the Iraqis, with significant air and artillery support from the Americans, tried 3 different strategies, none of which worked particularly well. The first was kicking indoors, a lot of casualties there. The second was precision-guided munitions, which were very expensive, in short supply, and didn't work that well because the ISIL was using human shields. And the third was just unguided gravity bombs and artillery shells, which ended up being working, but they killed about 10,000 civilians while driving out the insurgents. And so, but what if there's a fourth strategy, which is what I call the autonomous air-ground assault platoon. So this is a Uran-9 tank. You have this tiny little reconnaissance drone here. So these are attacking in a swarm, again, completely without fear, moving faster, reacting faster. There's no morale damage when you lose half the platoon. The Ukrainians are doing this in a very primitive way right now. They try this with a ground swarm. They supposedly have this company called Swarmer, which is doing this with 3 drones. But there is no upper limit on the number of drones that you can put into a swarm. So ask yourself, if you're in this situation, you're that Iraqi soldier, do you want to go down in that tunnel? Or would you just as soon send the robots? The third example is, this is the Russian submarine Belgorod. It's armed with a truly horrific and destabilizing weapon, the Poseidon, which is a nuclear-armed torpedo, a 100-megaton warhead with a nuclear reactor propulsion. And so it can theoretically theoretically destroy every coastal city and every naval base in the U.S. simultaneously, right? Completely without warning, theoretically. Now, the Russians may be exaggerating its capabilities a little bit, but nonetheless, that's the threat. So on the bottom, we have the Boeing Orca, which is an uncrewed U.S. asset, range is 6,000 nautical miles. We've been talking about putting torpedoes on it for a decade. That may have happened. Obviously a lot of things happen classified that I do not have any knowledge of. And so let's imagine the Orca has a firing solution on the Belgorod. But so should it come to periscope depth and find a human somewhere to get permission? And if it does, it will likely lose the firing solution, maybe even get destroyed itself. Or should it just simply destroy the Belgorod and save the eastern seaboard? Okay, so you can see I've constructed these scenarios just to show you the enormous pressure there will be in the coming decades to use these highly autonomous weapons. So in addition to these 3 arenas, I also hypothesize that we'll see the same thing in the following arenas: sea surface, cyber warfare, psychological warfare, space, and decision support systems. So, prediction is kind of a fool's game, right? So I hasten to add that I'm not predicting which countries are going to triumph, which companies, which specific weapons, and what arena will happen first. All I'm saying is within 30 years or 40 years that this will become the sine qua non of military power. So the next slide has to do with the nature of autonomous weapons. So again, we come back to the precedent question of we have all these decisions that AI is making for us. And I need to add another one here, which is Albania, which is prone to corruption, has added sourcing, making final decisions on government procurement. This is just reported last week. So, but this is a complicated slide, but the summary point is very simple. It's when you look at the y-axis, which is time pressure, and you look at the x-axis, which is secrecy, autonomous weapons are very unique. So granting parole and sentencing a criminal are very enormous decisions, right? But we have months. We typically take months to make those decisions. And if a government chooses, they can publicize the results and they could make it subject to multiple levels of review. Whereas autonomous weapons, aerial combat, you're talking about a fraction of a second, decision time. Cyber warfare, you're talking about milliseconds, intense time pressure. And then also, there is these layers of opacity which surround this whole thing. And so I'm studying agnotology, which is the nature of ignorance, with a professor at Stanford. And I believe that this is a particularly interesting case of this. So you have, first of all, you have the fact that how these targeting models work is going to be a very, very tightly guarded secret for obvious reasons. And so for any particular targeting model, you could have less than a dozen people that understand how this thing works. The second is normal accident theory, Charles Perrow. He says that if you have three characteristics, you will inevitably have accidents. One is danger, like air traffic control, nuclear reactor. Two is complexity, and three is tightly coupled. Tightly coupled is another name for autonomy in an autonomous system, right? So this will absolutely have catastrophic results on occasion. And the other thing that's very interesting about this is it's arguably impossible to predict exactly what's going to happen in a real conflict, because we don't have the boundaries of the system, right? The boundaries of the system include our adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea, whatever, and we have no idea what their capabilities are. Or we have some idea, but there's a lot of unknowns, and when you get into a battle where these weapons are trying to destroy each other, we'll have emergent behavior, which will be extremely hard to predict. Three, algorithmic opacity is a well-understood problem. You have billions of parameters, 7-digit numbers that don't translate well into human language, and I'll speed up here because I think I'm running over time. But algorithmic opacity, and then there's this question of should AI be granted access to fields of knowledge that humans don't. So General Shanahan, 2017, said specifically that when he was writing Joint Forces Quarterly. So I will leave it at that and turn it over to you, sir.
All right. Thank you, Tim. We're going to go with some responses now from David and Julie, or from Lieutenant Colonel Von Bargen and Julie, Dr. Carpenter. So we'll start with you.
Thank you. I'll just start by sort of the standard disclaimer. My views are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Defense Department or the Army. By the way, is my mic working? Excellent. I think I am less pessimistic on proliferation of AI systems, and I know we're going to talk on some of these bits later. But I think that we are not necessarily going to see as strong a proliferation across all domains and across all sort of systems of warfare. I do think you're right that we will absolutely see aspects of autonomous or highly autonomous weapons systems being used. But like I said, in terms of the sort of inevitability of an arms race, I think I'm less pessimistic. And sort of the examples I'll give are, right, we have prohibitions against the use of biological and chemical weapons. Did that stop them from being used everywhere? No, but it did stop them from being used in a lot of places. Similarly, we've got restrictions on the use of landmines, anti-proliferation for nuclear weapons. I think that there's a likelihood that eventually we will get to some sort of better definition of the space and a better definition of what most nations are willing to sign on to restriction-wise. But as an example, right, those aren't 100%. The United States is not a signatory to the landmine treaty, as are a number of our allies not signatories. So it's not 100%.
Thank you. Dr. Carpenter, your response.
Yeah, okay. So I think a lot, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this. I'm happy to participate, and I'm delighted to be on this panel with my esteemed military colleagues here. But I do want to say, I think I am highly concerned about the ethical risks of autonomous weapons, which is always sort of a weird phrase in and of itself. I think what Tim called to was the opacity of the problem, which part of it is by necessity of having classified information, but that is certainly problematic when it becomes one of the defining characteristics of it as a weapon systems, when its capabilities and its failure rates and its real-world deployments are all classified, or almost all classified. It becomes impossible to evaluate the proportionality, the accountability, the civilian risk assessments, and we end up debating things that might happen instead of evidence-based outcomes, and that ambiguity is shifting moral and accountable responsibility. It's spreading it out to civilians and operators and even people standing by and civilians watching, and it still concentrates power with the institutions that own the data, and that's a very unstable foundation, ethically and as far as tactically even.
Thank you. So we had a prep call before this where we talk about, does anybody want to talk about the positive sides of this? So I'm playing devil's advocate here just to present what is the positive case for autonomous weapons. And we basically came up with 6 things, which is that the number one thing is that you can save potentially lives of your own soldiers. You keep them out of harm's way, as Tim was showing in that slide. Nobody wants to go down the tunnel. You send a robot down the tunnel instead. The flip side of that is also something that Tim mentioned, which is that you can put robots into risks that you would not put a human being into. You can send as many robots in the tunnel as you want to, as long as you have robots to send. And in that case, if you deem that to be an acceptable risk, it's a different calculation when you're talking about something that's not a human being. Number 3, they can operate autonomously in electronic warfare environments. So one of the things that's happening in Ukraine is that there's a lot of electronic jamming going on, obviously. They're trying to send radio signals back and forth. If you have a more autonomous system, it's less likely to be disabled in that manner. Number 4, people have speculated that potentially artificial intelligence and robots can better follow the rules of engagement and laws of war. Maybe they'll be better at, for example, discrimination between soldiers and civilians. If you put humans in high-pressure circumstances, sometimes they make mistakes. If you put a robot in that circumstance, maybe it can make either the discrimination faster, or it can take more risk about not pulling the trigger before it knows for sure. Number 5, a nation might produce autonomous weapons faster than it can produce soldiers. So, for example, one of the things happening in Ukraine right now is that both sides have used quote unquote, killed an awful lot of their own people. This is just the realities of warfare. People die. If you can produce autonomous weapons faster than you can train new soldiers, that gives you an advantage compared to other people. And the last one is a point that Tim kind of referred to, which is the idea autonomous weapons aren't necessarily going to mean that you're going to win in a war, but if you don't have them, you're very likely to lose against an opponent who does have them. So that's kind of the positive case from a certain perspective. If you have them, then that's good, and if you don't, then that's bad. Tim and Lieutenant Colonel and Dr. Carpenter, let's start with Tim. What are your kind of reactions to that positive case?
So there's a number of distinct reasons why people oppose this. So and I'll give you some specific data on that. So polls of thousands of people show a majority of people on the planet calling for a ban. So Ipsos 2018, 52% in America, 61% globally. YouGov 2019, 73% of Europeans oppose autonomous weapons. So there's a number of reasons for this. One is they think it will, there'll be horrific catastrophes, and I think that will absolutely happen. That's not to say that in aggregate, for achieving any particular military objective, that civilian casualties won't be less. So that is, by consequentialist reasoning, is the metric you should use. But I think everyone, as you sit here, you know that there's going to be horrific catastrophes, right? It will sink a hospital ship. It will destroy a civilian airliner. So that's number one, catastrophes. Number two is it's kind of a gross power imbalance. So most of the lesser developed countries in the world, from 30 countries, from Algeria to Zimbabwe, have signed a ban treaty, right? So that's part of it. I think there's the fear that it will lower the threshold for war if you don't put human lives at risk, your lives of your own military at risk. There is the artificial general intelligence, which I'm guessing we will get to, which is a separate issue. But then finally, if you put all that aside, there's still yet another overarching issue, which is it is a fundamental assault on human dignity. A lot of people feel that way. And so most religions, or I think every major religion, holds every human life sacred. The Talmud says, whoever saves a single human life saves the whole world, right? And the secular humanism has common cause with this, right? Every human life is held to be sacred. And so this is the routine delegation of lethal violence to an algorithm. It doesn't enhance us, all right? So I'll be a little bit. I'll throw a little literary flair into here. So Copernicus told us that we're not the center of the universe, right? Darwin told us we're not God's special children. But arguably we got better because of those realizations, right? We moved past that, and we came to grips with it. This is not that. It is a step in the wrong direction. It is a diminishing, a degradation, and an erosion of our agency, of our humanity. It's a humiliation, I think. And so this is my idealism coming through. But I think it's going to happen. And I'll tell you later about what I think the U.S. should do about this. But I also think it is an assault on human dignity.
I think the use cases that you both have presented will be, in many respects, compelling, right? We're already seeing not lethal autonomous weapons, but decision support tools being used by militaries around the world, including the United States military, that are autonomous or semi-autonomous. But those are decision support tools, the sort of certainly a human in the loop type of system. But for all those use cases, right, the compelling nature of being able to operate in an entirely denied, electronic warfare denied area will be certainly compelling. I am very skeptical of the idea that a AI system will be able to better discriminate based on sort of law of armed conflict or to adhere to those laws better than a human. And I personally, again, speaking as myself, tend to agree with the idea of AI systems, especially generative ones, as being sort of inherently anti-human. But so I think we will see a mixed bag of use cases where some of these systems don't live up to the hype, and some that will.
Dr. Carpenter.
Yeah, I agree that Gen AI is going to be its own sort of conversation as far as there's clearly a whole range of tools we're talking about here, from decision support tools to autonomous nuclear weapons. But when we're talking about, I think it was Tim that spoke to earlier, he was talking about how, or maybe it was Brian, you were saying how, first of all, I guess I want to say that that first book that you alluded to that I wrote and did the research on focused on explosive ordnance disposal personnel. And I am totally for semi-autonomous tools to use to keep people safe. In the case of EOD operators, the robots they use are not weaponized and are semi-autonomous, and it clearly helps keep military personnel as well as civilians at a safe distance during operations, and are extremely helpful. But when you're talking about autonomous weapons and how it can be more efficient and speed and collapse that human decision time, that collapsing of decision time, it would seem to me as a non-military person, would also weaken your safeguards, because it's introducing a machine speed that human reasoning can't keep up with, as far as it's escalating a situation where normally a human in the loop would have to deal with verification, diplomacy, and of course the ethics and rules of engagement around it. So even the possibility of autonomous weapons, I think, agreeing with the Colonel and Tim, is not, it's premature, and I'm not even sure if premature is the word. How do I put this? I'm not going to say dignified. It's hard to imagine a scenario where adding autonomy to nuclear systems, for example, which was brought up earlier, would reduce risk. So when we talk about predicting the future, which is also something I don't like to do, but is the nature of this conversation, right? How is that going to reduce risk? We really don't know. This is all theoretical and therefore problematic, extremely problematic.
All right, there's so many things to talk about. I want to talk next about uncertainty. There's so much secrecy surrounding these weapons. How does uncertainty shape the ethical debate around them? Dr. Carpenter, if we could let you continue on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we've been sort of saying, it's the defining condition of the autonomous weapons landscape by necessity, by it being classified weapons, but just by the nature of it being so divisive and polarizing and new. And when we don't understand and cannot predict in any way or shape or form the system capabilities, its failure modes, or what it's going to be like in a real world deployment, it becomes impossible to evaluate things like risk, the accountability, the proportionality of destruction. And as we've also touched on, there's incentives driving development. No one wants to be at a strategic disadvantage. So this is not necessarily an arms race that's driven by enthusiasm, but it's driven by a fear of falling behind. And actually, you don't know if you've fallen behind when there's tremendous opacity in what systems you have or don't have access to. There's this underlying narrative to this race towards a strategic advantage of these efficient autonomous weapons, that this autonomy or autonomous weapons equals some sort of inevitability. And again, as David and Tim both pointed out, I don't think it's an inevitable path, but it's probably a path that we see ourselves on, even though it's not as transparent, I think, as any of us would like to, any degree, because there is the strategic fear.
Thank you. Lieutenant Colonel, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think part of the opacity, that sort of lack of understanding, one is the fact that we're still under development, but two, right, the nature of AI systems is that generally they are so complex we can't backtrace where they came from. They're certainly not human level intelligence, but they are, like a human brain, a black box that we cannot see the gears inside of. So, as someone who teaches a lot of future autonomous weapons systems, i.e. the cadets in front of us, right, we understand that those black boxes come with a series of values, and then we teach and inculcate the values that the United States Army and the Department of Defense and the United States of America believe in. But we also, again, this is not what I anticipate for any of them in this room, but we also have mechanisms to punish those who violate them, right? If a soldier goes out and commits a war crime, that soldier is punished under various laws. And we may not be able to understand exactly how that soldier gets to that point, but we do have sort of back-end mechanisms.
Right.
If you have a self-destructing loitering munition, how do you enforce anything on it? And again, that is, we get closer to the more Gen AI ideas, but how do you fix a problem with a system that you don't understand and have no accountability over?
Yeah.
There's no retroactive on that one.
So DoD 3000.09 is the government's regulation that governs this, and it says simply that humans shall exert appropriate levels of human judgment over autonomous weapons, which frankly could mean anything. It is an exercise in strategic ambiguity. And so I go back to Professor Robert Proctor, Stanford, agnotology, the nature of ignorance. And so often ignorance is constructed for governments, other organizations, constructed for a reason. I think the U.S. is doing that to a degree right now. So AI has been called the third offset. So the first offset was nuclear weapons, ICBMs, spy satellites, which we used to hold the Soviets at bay in the 50s. Then second offset we won the Cold War with, which was nuclear submarines, precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft. The third offset is largely AI. So this is our strategy, right? We don't like to take casualties. We like to build exquisite weapon systems that are better than anything else in the world. We think we can win at this game. And so the last thing we want to do is codify in writing what is our default ethic right now, which is maintain a human in the loop. That's the way DoD 3000.09 is currently interpreted. But it was signed by a Deputy Secretary of Defense. It could be changed tomorrow, or we could simply just change the interpretation, And so I think it's the U.S. government is constructed another layer of opacity in addition to all the other ones that I mentioned, specifically around this issue.
And to that particular DoD explicitly exempts cyber from those weapon systems. So cyber weapon systems, i.e. that don't involve true kinetics or true lethality, are not governed by that DoD.
Yeah, really great point. So there are a lot of headwinds to autonomous weapons in the military because the military wants traditional honorable martial virtues and roles. And so there are several places where military culture seems to be at odds with autonomous weapons. One point, ceding authority to AI seems bad because humans are supposed to be leaders. And you can't promote leaders based on not leading. Second point, there seems to be some dishonor associated with autonomous weapon systems. There's no nobility in the use of them. There's no opportunity to show courage or skill in order to advance. Third point, human use of AI is going to lead to de-skilling and dependency upon AI. possibly not only for physical military work, but also for the thinking side of military work. And the fourth point, all this AI might make humans obsolete at war, with this being the equivalent of civilian-induced, AI-induced unemployment could happen equivalent to the military. I'd love to hear the reactions from each of you to some of these ideas here. Let's start with you, Lieutenant Colonel.
I think, I don't know that I agree 100% with the sort of concept of honor. Mm-hmm. It's less about the fact that humans need to be doing the fighting, but more that we have established over centuries a deep code of what is ethical mm-hmm. fighting, right? That is the law of armed conflict. That is, in the case of the Army values, and it's how do you ensure, right, as we inculcate that to soldiers, how do we ensure that these autonomous systems are also adhering to the law of armed conflict, to U.S. law, and how do we ensure that those values are, in fact, mm-hmm. maintained? Mm-hmm.
Dr. Carpenter, do you have thoughts on these ideas related to AI and kind of the structure of military organizations?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, as somebody who never served, I can't speak to the anecdotally to a role of honor and its long historical traditions within the armed services. But I did want to touch on a subject that we had talked about in our pre-talk. Actually, two things. One is one that the Colonel mentioned about AI being a black box, and I think that this is relevant too, which is the idea of honor versus trauma versus being there on the battlefield and the differences between those. So one thing that the Colonel mentioned was AI being a black box, or the kind of AI that is used by the Department of War right now is traditionally viewed as a black box. And I want to clarify from my point of view, as an expert in this field, that the people selling it love to say that it's a black box, and they love to say that even they don't have a complete understanding of how it works. But these things are clearly very intentionally, specifically designed by lots of people to have very specific data sets and ranges and alignment and all sorts of things. When people often say that it's a black box and they don't understand it, what they mean is, or what they're saying in sort of a vague way, is they don't necessarily understand in that moment how an AI came up with that specific recommendation, but it can certainly be traced back to the data sets and things like that. So there is a traceability of accountability that's in there if it's sought. But sort of related to that, when we're talking about things like honor and morale and maybe what a traditional warfighter would look like, I think I can bring up the research I did with EOD personnel as well as with drone operators, where both are dealing with semi-autonomous weapons or tools at a distance. The EOD personnel, the operators who actually handle the robots, would actually view the robots as an extension of their physical body in some ways, because they made the ultimate decisions behind that semi-autonomous robots' tactics or strategies to mitigating or diffusing the ordnance and rendering it safe. So if things didn't go well, even if it had nothing to do with what the operator's choices were, if the robot, for example, started spinning around in a wadi, was a technical problem, the robot operator still felt personally responsible, and in that way see the robot again as an extension of their physicality and as of their personal accountability and responsibility within the team. Now, when you talk about drone operators, when we're thinking back even a decade ago or more, when this was a relatively new to the public sort of position, there were a couple of things going on. One is the research was sort of showing, or people assumed, that drone operators would be somewhat removed emotionally from the damage and destruction that they caused on targets, the thinking was that it's sort of archaic, that like World War II bombers, pilots, and similarly in Vietnam and more recent battles, that the pilots would be removed from seeing the destruction they caused firsthand, and in that way would be spared a specific kind of trauma. However, we found that what they did was experience different kinds of trauma. For example, if you are doing drone work, unlike necessarily being a bomber pilot in World War II, you have extremely high fidelity cameras you can use potentially to surveil targets, and not just a target for a few minutes, but potentially for days or weeks at a time, and you get used to their daily habits, and that quote unquote target becomes a person or a family member, not to you, but you see them in their daily lives, you see them in their routines, and in that way become humanized. Or, for example, because the nature of drone work had to be so highly emotionally compartmentalized, where you might be on an active shift for 12 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, and you're in that high state of readiness, and then to go home on the base or off base or wherever it is a different kind of compartmentalization than being called to a mission when you're already deployed, right? So we're seeing different, it doesn't remove emotional burdens. What we're seeing is that it can shift them. So we shouldn't say that there's, I think what I can speak to, I guess, is the trauma. And so when we talk about moral injury, that can take the pace of more than just making those life and death decisions, but it's about the cultural recognition giving to those traditional combat roles. And the robots and drones are seen as extremities of the operator's self. And the military in general, militaries around the world, need to also understand that attachment, or the idea of seeing robots or drones or AI as an extension of self, is not a trivial idea. And it reflects how humans respond to systems that feel responsive or agentive or have various levels of autonomy. And those psychological realities should be part of any conversation we're having about autonomy, warfare, and those are my thoughts.
So how the military views autonomous weapons. So every male in my family for the last, or almost every male in my family for the last 3 generations has served in one capacity or another. So I have tremendous admiration. The most lethal, at the same time, the most professional military in history, arguably. Now, having said that, sometimes you get interesting incentives. So let me go back to Billy Mitchell, the father of the U.S. Air Force. He was in charge of all U.S. Aircraft in France in World War I. Coming out of that, he asserted vociferously that we needed to prioritize military aviation. The power structure that existed at the time, Army and Navy, did not take kindly to this, and they actually court-martialed him and forced him out of the Army. And then, obviously he's right? I mean, aviation was a crucial part of World War II. So, military can be very conservative and rigid at times. And so, in 1975, there was a proposal to put autonomous torpedoes in the Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom gap, and basically seal the Soviet Navy out of the Atlantic. And it probably wouldn't have worked. The technology wasn't there at the time. But in the New York Times, it was reported that the Pentagon, civilians, were angry with the Navy because the Navy cut this thing off at the knees because, the way you get more people to make admiral is you have more ships, right, and more submarines and more squadrons, not autonomy, not autonomous weapons. And so there's an element of self-preservation that is at work here. And some people believe that both the Navy and the Air Force have kind of slow-rolled their uncrewed combat aircraft specifically for that reason, because there's a reluctance to prioritize them.
Well, we've been getting a bunch of questions, and we're getting close to the end of our panel. We will let this go over a few minutes, just because we have so many questions that have come in now. If you have questions, please write them down on the cards and send them in. I've already kind of sorted them into different piles. But one of the questions here is kind of the fundamental question, right? The saying is all's fair in love and war, right? So what are we supposed to make of this, ethically speaking? Do we have a choice here? The person asks, ethics seems to be out the window. People are desperate. They're panicking. If you're in this sort of situation, if you get in a war, it really feels like you should do whatever it takes. So how do we kind of realistically avoid these worst case scenarios, especially considering that our opponents might not be as ethically interested as we are?
Gladly.
Yeah.
Start with that one. I mean, so amusingly enough, with my senior class, we just had a discussion where we discussed all's fair in love and war, and talked about why do we adhere to the laws of our conflict, i.e. Geneva Conventions, Hague Conventions, even if our adversaries do not. And there's a lot of reasons. One is adhering to the values that we as a nation, we as a Department of Defense, we as the Army, and as individuals believe are important. Mm-hmm. We make rules against torture because we think torture is bad. We don't use chemical weapons, biological weapons, all these things because, again, you can look at it sort of from a consequentialist or a Kantian ethical standpoint, but we don't do them because we think they are bad for one reason or another. Whether that is we don't want them used against us, even if that may not be the case depending on the adversary. And so I would rely on sort of the example of all of those conventions, starting from the 1880s all the way through 1949, of the various Geneva Conventions, Hague Conventions, that we can get around to regulation of this in some way. Will there be cheaters? Will there be people who do not adhere? Absolutely. But hopefully they will be the pariahs and the unusual ones, and that certain specific regulations can be put on this so that we are not violating the existing laws of armed conflict and going against our own values.
Yeah. Tim, do you have thoughts?
Yes, so let me reiterate my belief that proliferation will happen, the sine qua non, next 30 years hypothesis. But so I actually have three specific recommendations, policy recommendations, which I will go through quickly right now. One is that the U.S. should establish an adversarial model of testing, evaluation, verification, and validation to put autonomous weapons in place. So with the stakes so high that these weapons could, sink the hospital ship, or even worse, they could start a war that we did not want started, that you need this adversarial model. That the only way so you have a team of people there whose job it is to prove that this particular weapon should not be released. Okay, the same way our criminal justice system is adversarial. Second one has to do with control of the software and data. So in the Iraq War, the Boeing Scan Eagle, the Marine Corps did not buy that system. They rented it from Boeing. And it was not particularly problematic and controversial, but the precedent potentially is. So the risk is that basically it becomes a black box that the military uses, but really has no understanding of how it works. When it malfunctions, why did it malfunction? And that creates very perverse incentives. So the defense contractors would love this, right? They can increase pricing, they control it, they have all the power. Wall Street loves it because it's a predictable revenue stream. But arguably that can even create an incentive to start or prolong a war because you want to train your autonomous systems. You create an autonomous system that has not been trained in real combat, it's not that useful, right? That's why everyone's rushing to Ukraine right now, is to get, understand the bleeding edge of what's going on. So the U.S. should absolutely maintain strict control of the data and the software, legal ownership and pragmatic control. And the third is it has to do with the so DoD 3000.09. So I believe that we should have a more explicit coming to grips with what our strategy is. I don't believe that strategic ambiguity suits our long-term purposes. So you look at what happened in World War II. Unrestricted submarine warfare was unambiguously illegal, and yet immediately after Pearl Harbor, within 6 hours after Pearl Harbor attack, the admirals in Washington issued the order to conduct unrestricted submarine warfare. That was illegal, right? So I think what we should do is be more explicit as a country, and again, this is my idealism coming out, but more explicit about this, and say something along the lines of, this is unfortunate. This is a new arena. We have to move very carefully in this, but in order to protect our democracy and democracy worldwide, if our adversaries are using this, then we should also develop and be prepared to use highly autonomous weapons. At least we're being explicit about it, because if we're not, what's going to happen is we're going to get very close, and then 9/11, Pearl Harbor is going to happen, and then it's a matter of flipping a switch or downloading a software patch, and then the drone becomes autonomous, right? So those three recommendations are my thoughts.
Thank you. Dr. Carpenter, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, it was interesting you started this with all's fair in love and war, because actually the truth is that that's a completely untrue statement, right? It's not, especially when you're dealing with AI as one of the actors in the dynamic, right? I think what I can speak to is the idea of arms control frameworks, but the idea of them or the way they're structured, autonomy or autonomous weapons challenge that because they rely on things like transparency and verification and shared definitions, which right now we're not seeing with autonomous weapons. And I think that regulation should focus on keeping a human in the loop for human control and clear accountability chains. And that includes, as Tim was saying, enforceable testing standards. You need to have testing. And the transparency requirements from the outcomes of those testing and things that are the testing that's taking place. And it's challenging, I think, because autonomy doesn't fit neatly into existing arms control frameworks. And there's hope if we recognize that unconstrained deployment increases collective vulnerability. I mean, as I was saying before, even if we think we're gaining an advantage, we're also increasing risk, right, by speeding up all of these processes without humans in the loop and without accountability. So I think that the conversations also do need to shift from inevitability narratives to risk containment strategies that are rooted in human responsibility.
Yeah, these are all really great points that all three of you have made. One thing I would say is we mentioned consequentialist reasoning, we mentioned Kantian deontological reasoning. There's also the virtue ethics component to it, right? What kind of person would be using these sorts of weapons? Is that the kind of person that we want to be? If our opponents are being that kind of person, do we want to be like them, or are we different from the people that we're fighting against? We have to ask all these questions about human character and what we're trying to be, and not become worse just because we've been put into situations that are much worse. So one person asked a question saying, there seems to be a balance here. On the negative side is the loss of human autonomy or agency. On the positive side is the possible minimalization of lives lost in conflict. Any thoughts about balancing these two things, of maybe reducing the number of lives lost, but also losing human agency at the same time?
I don't think it's a binary, in my opinion. At least for myself, I think what I've been saying throughout this as a lens is that there should be a human in the loop, if for no other reason than for the accountability chain, and people need to be named and responsible for their own decision-making role in the process of this. So there does need to be human in the loop and accountability chain, but that doesn't mean that if there's a human in the loop that there will be no lives lost and that there will be an increased lives saved. Again, we're still talking in hopeful terms, shall we say.
So let me come back to my sine qua non, highly likely that this proliferation happens. And so there's an argument that we have been successful to some degree with containment of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, which is very true. But Paul Scharre, Center for New American Security, talks about why that probably will not be followed with autonomous weapons for 5 reasons. One, they have enormous military utility as opposed to nuclear weapons, which have an enormous stigma attached to them, obviously. And so do they have enormous utility or not? Because we haven't used them since 1945. Two, autonomous weapons are not clearly defined. Three, they lack a horrific nature as opposed to a nuclear weapon, which is extremely indiscriminate. Four, their use is often transparent. So how do you tell when a MQ-9 launches a Hellfire missile? How do you know whether it's the algorithm or the pilot in Creech, Nevada? Yeah, the answer is you don't. If you're on the ground, you have no idea who launched the Hellfire. And five, it's the ultimate dual-use technology. Technology gets sold, it gets stolen, people move from country to country, company to company. So, and the other thing I'll say is the one bright spot in the anti-proliferation has been nuclear weapons. For obvious reasons, mixing AI and nuclear command and control is extremely risky. So, but even there's a thin end of the wedge. Lowther and McGiffin have written 2 articles that say we need a dead hand system, which is if our enemy decapitates us, how do we respond? We need a credible second strike alternative. You need something that will launch the missiles. The Soviet Union had the perimeter system, which was designed to do this. It's supposedly still in use today. The UK had a letters of last resort. The Prime Minister handwrites, which I think is a brilliant solution, which is far better than the AI. The Prime Minister handwrites a letter and gives it, and it sits in the safe of the commanding officer of the 4 ballistic missile submarines, and it's only opened if communication with higher authorities is eliminated. And it could say a lot of different things. It could say, use your own best judgment. It could say stand down. It could say do whatever our allies are doing. But the point is that no one knows what it says, and so it still acts as a credible deterrent. So, but the time pressure is growing. So you have hypersonic weapons. You have the Poseidon 100 megaton warhead, which could liquidate every coastal city and naval base simultaneously. The president has maybe 10 to 20 minutes. That's shrinking. So the pressure to use decision support systems that could be very escalatory, that could make a mistake, even in nuclear warfare, will be enormous.
I think I'll say it also really depends on what type of systems, right? You have different time pressures, different requirements, and these definitions become really important, right? The difference between a uniformed combatant and a civilian through a drone camera is a lot more similar than, let's say, a submarine. There are very few civilian submarines, certainly of certain sizes, out in the Pacific. So that level of determination of is this a enemy or a civilian is a lot sort of easier or harder to make, depending on whether we're talking the cyber domain, the air domain, the ground domain, the sea domain. The question then is, so sometimes you have the distinction problem set, and then sometimes you have the decision whether to fire. Right? If you were engaged in open warfare, declared war, then engaging the enemy submarine, as long as you can determine it's an enemy submarine, valid and helpful. It's whether you want the autonomous system to start the war, et cetera, and that's where you have the problem sets I see. But I do see a really big distinction between the services and the domains on how they will potentially use and think about these things.
Yeah. So we're going to take one more question. I know we've gone a little bit over time, but we'll continue we have so many good questions here. It's really hard to decide, and I apologize if I do not get to your question because there are just so many really good questions here. The last question I think we're going to take then is on generative AI. Generative AI is involved in for example, the at least communications interface in certain types of systems like with decision support and other sorts of places you can envision these things being involved. What are your, and of course the systems are also vulnerable to hallucination and bias and all these other sorts of things. Why don't we start with Dr. Carpenter? What are your thoughts on generative AI and lethal autonomous weapon systems?
Yeah, where do I even start? I mean, I guess to be succinct, because we're at the end here, I would say extremely problematic, to say the very least, if for no other reason than the hallucinations, then the fact that people tend to over-rely on them, that tools that are often presented as decision support often don't stay decision support, they don't stay advisory in its role. People can overweight machine confidence, especially if it sounds human-like, especially if it sounds authoritative, as if it knows what it's talking about, and can present you with a bunch of reasons why it might make a certain choice. Even when the underlying model is flawed or just making things up, then the axiom of garbage in, garbage out, which is things are, generative AI is only as good as the initial data sets that it's learning on and what it learns from the people using it, and that can create a tremendous loop of bias, and the bias from the original data sets that mean people start to use these biased things to make their very important decisions on, as decision support becomes then institutionalized error and not just decision support for a human in the loop. As you said, they can hallucinate, and they make productive sounding recommendations that can be entirely wrong. And so the danger isn't just bad outputs, it's how those outputs are steering or human judgment, and that biased data becomes institutionalized as a version of truth. And over-reliance shifts accountability again, so it becomes harder to identify who's responsible when the human's judgment has been shaped by the gen AI and its data, or nudged, or by the automated suggestions. And because I know very little, and there's little public information about the type of decision support tools that are used every day in the military for obvious reasons, that's what I'll say to that. Those are my concerns.
Thank you.
So we're talking about decision support systems here. So the military, I think it's a very good hypothesis, has access to cutting edge, unlimited assets and cutting edge hardware and software in this arena. And so these models are running constantly. They're what should we do if Russia, comes through the Fulda Gap? What should we do if North Korea comes, stuff at the DMZ, et cetera, et cetera. And so I go back to AlphaGo 2016. It was the AI model that beat Lee Sedol, one of the most powerful Go players in history. Go is a very complicated strategy game, far more complicated than chess. This surprised a lot of people. It was a Sputnik moment for China, 60 million people watching it live in China. And so the question is, it's a thought experiment. The question is, how is the modern battlefield different from a Go game? And so, what would you need to have to happen in order for it to become perfectly transparent? And the answer is three things: sensors, bandwidth, and intelligence. So sensors, Internet of Things, every moving part on the planet, we're going towards this, will have a sensor and be attached to the internet. So we're doing this in the military, right? Every vehicle and aircraft, we know its location, we know its fuel level, we know its ammunition level. We're monitoring the vital signs of individual soldiers. So the sensors are moving rapidly in that direction. The bandwidth, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But technologies grow more powerful every day. They can be jammed. And if you look over the long arc of history, though, bandwidth, wireless bandwidth, the long distances is going in one direction. And then you have the intelligence, the AI, to make sense of all this, right? So if those three things come together, and I think they will largely in the next 30 years, then it's just like the Go game. And AlphaGo, it beat the best player in the world 100-0. Okay, there's no contest now between AI and humans when the battlefield is transparent.
The bit I'll say, kind of going back to the original part on the generative AI, right? I agree that we get an over-reliance, and in our earlier discussion we talked about how both people, we sort of de-skill ourselves when we become over-reliant. One reason we teach cadets how to navigate on the land using a compass and map is that GPS does not always work, right? And if you are over-reliant on the technology, you become less capable individually. And then two, I think going back to the discussion or the example was given earlier about people's social connection to systems, right? The EOD tech's reliance and anthropomorphication, if you will, of their robots. And I have examples of that in my own career, right? We absolutely named the EOD robots Johnny 5 after the short circuit movies of the 1980s, and soldiers got actively angry when the robot was destroyed. I think you will see similar problems with those decision support tools, especially when generative AI makes them seem more human-like, right? We are social creatures, and we are influenced by the social environment in which we live. I do also have concerns about the use of generative AI to humanize the decision support tool. Yeah. Because the other thing that let me just finish this one bit. The AlphaGo, the other bit with that is that a lot of the experts on Go were sort of blown away by the moves the computer made, because the computer did not operate like a human Go player. They had novel techniques that had really not been explored by human Go players before, and computers may be able to continue to do that sort of thing. Sorry, cutting you off.
Dr. Carpenter.
No, I was just going to say that my work with EOD bears out exactly what you said, and I want to point out one of the differences between, for example, EOD perhaps assigning a persona to a robot versus somebody, a soldiers or sailors naming a ship or people naming a tank, is the perceived amount of agency and autonomy that robot has, where it then becomes a social character within the team for usually a variety of factors. It has to do, attachment has to do with how much time that robot has as part of the team. It has to do with maybe the age makeup of the team members. It has to do with There was a time when EOD were being recruited where the EOD robots were being presented specifically for the MOS recruitment commercials, as it were, as if the robot was, they said explicitly, was to be regarded as a team member. So that's how people are being primed. And the questions that my book asks, that specific book asks, is not just looking at EOD, but putting that in the larger cultural framework historically. When I looked at archival research of the military and where the US military and other militaries around the world are going, we're seeing a move more towards human-like interfaces and even animal-like interfaces. We've all seen Spot the robot dog being used in various, weaponized, non-weaponized ways. But then, of course, as he was saying, people will project human-like personas onto these agents. And when they become social to us, it's going to affect our decision-making. They become persuasive as a rhetorical device, whether or not we trust them. And we calibrate our trust as a constant condition of our interactions with them. And as he indicated, we can feel a sense of loss, whether that loss is embedded in a tool loss, anger that our tool was blown up, or anger that we feel like we lost some sort of a social relationship, temporarily disrupted or otherwise, to a specific robot or AI or persona. And these are very real psychological elements of warfare that will affect things like decision-making as well as trauma that do have to be considered.
All right. We've reached well over the end of our time. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much to all of you in the audience, online and in person, and thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.